And that really radically interrupts the story for the expert in the Jewish law. See, the Jewish synagogues every day in the Jewish synagogues, they would pray that Samaritans would not participate in eternal life. They don't love Samaritans because they believe that God doesn't love Samaritans. In the Mishnah, which is a first century commentary for Jews on the Old Testament, it says that Samaritans are just trash, and it refers to them as swine. So we have just struck an emotional chord with this expert in the Jewish law when Jesus says, and here comes a Samaritan. And I just want to ask you, who is that for you? Who would interrupt your story? Believer, blank. Who is that for you? Is it homosexual? Is it someone who's black? Is it someone who's white? Is it someone who's rich? Is it someone who's poor? Is it someone who's Middle Eastern? Is it a business competitor? Is it a boss? Is it an employee? Is it a bad communicator or a good communicator? Someone who's rude with their words, someone who's ultra-sensitive. Is it a Muslim? Is it a Presbyterian? Is it a Catholic? Is it a Methodist? Is it a Baptist? Is it a Lutheran? Is it someone who has it all together, or someone who doesn't? A person who has trouble confessing, or someone that just confesses all the time? Is it a person who holds it all in? What is it? Who is that person for you? Who would interrupt your story? Sadly, it might be your spouse, it might be your child, it might be a former friend, it might be a sibling, but I want you to take out that paper doll that's in your bulletin. And I want you to write that person, that general person, maybe it's a specific person, I want you to write that person in that box that's on that paper doll. See, for me, that person was the homeless. I grew up in formative years under Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan made a statement that people choose to be poor, and I kind of bought into that. And I had struggled in my life, but one thing was for sure, and I am today still, I'm a recovering workaholic. And I just had very little patience of understanding homeless situations, but I had gone through, finally, a point in my life where circumstances were beyond my control. And I was invited to come look at the homeless shelter and asked to give a lot of money to me, not a lot of money in the scope of things, but a lot of money to me, to the homeless shelter, and I didn't want to do it. And so I'm going to the homeless shelter in DeKalb County. I knew the guy that led that, and I'm on my way there. This is probably 1997. I had just built our house. I think we're getting ready to move in, and I think Megan was about 7 and Kelsey was about 4. And Lily wasn't here yet. And so I go in there, and I didn't know where to go, didn't know what door to go into, and I go into the homeless shelter, and the very first person I encounter is a little 4-year-old girl. And I had only gone there because I had studied the Bible intently for 5 years, and I knew that the Bible said that Matthew 25 thing. And out of sheer obedience to God, fighting all the way, it's the only reason I went in there, and I was shocked. My story was interrupted by a 4-year-old girl because I didn't think ever in my life about children being homeless. And I have no idea what Thad Smith said to me that day, because that girl had convinced me that I was writing the check. I don't know what he said, but I went back to my office and I wrote the check because of a little homeless 4-year-old girl. And I had just built my house, and I had a daughter the same age, and I was convicted. Well, the Samaritan's that guy for this story and for that Jewish expert in the law. See, the priest, he came down the road. The Levite, he came to the place. And you'll see in the text in verse 33, the Samaritan comes on the man. He comes upon the man. Samaritan's not a Gentile. He's also bound by the law. And in the listener's minds, he's the least likely of the 3 people so far to help. He's the most likely to pass by. And he probably saw the other 2 pass by. And he's got a problem. You know, if he gets involved, they're going to think that he did it. And he can't get reimbursement from Jews because he's a Samaritan. And he's got a decision to make. Am I going to get involved? Because everything's telling him, do not get involved. But with God, it's a kingdom of the heart. It's a matter of the heart. Jesus says, Luke 17:21, the kingdom is within you. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies. And it says that this Samaritan guy, is moved to compassion. But the compassion leads him to action. And he bandages a man's wounds and he pours oil and wine on them, which was forbidden by Jewish law. He was not allowed to do that because he was a Samaritan. Dr. Gilbert Belzekian says this. He says that compassion is defined by the downward mobility of the living God of the universe, who by his very nature serves. See, it always comes from God. And compassion, real compassion, is compassion that leads to action. 1 John 4:8 says God is love. So I call this guy a dealer because the Samaritan receives love from God and he sends it out. He receives love from God and he sends it out. And he places this man on his donkey, which is the cultural form of a servant. This may be a picture of Jesus in the story. The Samaritan may be a picture of Jesus. He places him on a donkey. He probably had a caravan. He put him on his own donkey and he leads him. And that was not done in the culture. And there's no inn. It says he takes him to the inn. There's no inn on that 17-mile stretch. He's taking him to Jericho. He's taking him on quite possibly a 17-mile journey. Did they talk? You think the Samaritan said anything to the beaten man? Do you think he prayed? Do you think he pointed him to God? You think he touched him? Doesn't say it in the text. But you got to wonder what happened there. You got to wonder what happened. You know, was he once beaten? Was a Samaritan once beaten? Shared a little story with a guy this week here on staff and said there's just something about people who have hurt, who get the message of God, and they live out that message. C.S. Lewis says God whispers to us in our successes. He speaks to us in our conscience, and he screams at us in our pain. Well, he takes him to the inn, and he pays 2 denarii, which is 2 days' wages. And that's enough in that point in time to pay for 24 days at the inn. And he's not going to get reimbursed. It's not going to happen. So Jesus says, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor? And the Jewish expert in the law, who can't stand Samaritans, won't even speak the name. And he says, the one who showed mercy on him. And Jesus says something that's going to humble the heart of this guy unless he proudly resists it. And he says, go and do likewise. Go and do likewise, because your neighbor is bigger than your neighborhood. Jesus reframes the question, who is my neighbor, to whom must I become a neighbor? And the Samaritan is now the teacher to the Jewish expert in the law. See, I've made up my mind that I'm not going to tell people in this kind of a setting that the gospel message is just about being saved. The gospel message should not be reduced to that, because the gospel message is to become a fully devoted follower of Jesus Christ. It's his life that we're introducing people to. Well, how do you do that? Just quickly. A concealer is selective. He wants only his neighbor to be in this small box. And this is a difference between legalism, a concealer, and love, a dealer. He's selective, but the dealer, I'm going to give you CIA, is creative. He's creative with time and space. It is all rooted in the Creator. All rooted in the Creator with time and space. I don't have time to go into it now, but we've taken time and space out of ministry. Bill Hybels says it this way: you'll never look in the eyes of someone who doesn't matter to God. He created them all. Because God is love, he creates.